In 1873, a bank failure in America crashed the entire world economy in ways people did not expect. You are about to follow that collapse from booming railroads to battered factories across continents. The opening moment feels almost cinematic because finance and industry were intertwined with incredible speed, even in that era. You will feel the irony of a local bank causing global panic in a world that was supposed to be isolated. The story begins with a mania for railroads and credit that promised to reshape cities and continents. But here is where it gets interesting, because the tools and markets that enabled expansion also became the channels of contagion. You need to understand the scale of the railroad fever to grasp why people overextended themselves so wildly. Investors, speculators, and banks poured capital into rails with dreams of endless returns and national transformation. The rails were seen as the arteries of modern growth, and they attracted both rational investors and reckless gamblers. You also should picture towns sprouting overnight around tracks and engines bringing promised prosperity to frontier corners of empires. The construction required massive upfront capital, and banks extended long-term credit that created enormous fragility beneath apparent progress. As you watch the rails spread, you should feel the tension between ambition and leverage increasing with every mile laid. Railroad companies issued bonds by the ton, and banks bought them with confidence that seemed unassailable. You must picture ledgers filled with railroad debt and boardrooms that assumed perpetual expansion as an economic law. That collective hubris is the kind that can inflate bubbles when credit is easy and optimism is contagious. You will notice how leverage multiplied across institutions as one bank's grip passed into another bank's holdings without real reserves backing it. The system looked stable from a distance because assets sat on balance sheets, but the underlying cash flows were precarious in times of strain. This is the first thread of a pattern you will see repeated in financial crises across history. You should know about Jay Cooke because he was the era's most famous financier and a household name to many investors. Cooke had financed the Union War effort through massive bond sales and had built enormous credibility with the public and institutions. That credibility turned into market power as his new firm shifted from war bonds to railroad financing with extraordinary influence. You must imagine the public trust in his firm as almost patriotic, since Cooke was associated with national unity and prosperity after the Civil War. He poured capital into the Northern Pacific Railroad and convinced countless investors and institutions to follow his lead. What happened next will shock you because even giants can topple when their bets fail. As railroad construction expanded west, costs rose and returns slowed, and financial pressure mounted quietly beneath the surface of optimism. You should sense the growing mismatch between long-term railroad promises and short-term liquidity needs for banks and investors. When earnings failed to meet projections, the market's patience wore thin, and markets began pricing risk differently. You will also want to understand how seasonal cash needs and construction payments created timing problems for lenders and contractors. Banks were dependent on continuous confidence, and any crack in trust could force rapid repricing of assets. That fragile timing problem turned a solvency risk into a panic risk when the wrong event happened at the wrong moment. By the summer of 1873, the system looked stretched and vulnerable, despite apparent progress on tracks. You must imagine a world where markets communicated across oceans by telegraph and steamships, making contagion faster than ever before. Financial decisions in New York and Vienna started to affect each other because capital moved in real time compared to previous centuries. You should remember that this global communication transformed local shocks into international crises because banks had cross-border exposures and investors held foreign securities. When confidence wavered in one financial center, it did not stay contained due to the interconnection of credit. What happened next forced these theoretical risks into violent reality for millions of people. The 18th of September 1873 is a date you need to remember because it marks the collapse of Jay Cooke Company in New York. You should picture the bank's doors closing and the immediate panic that sent investors scrambling for liquidity. Cooke's overcommitment to Northern Pacific bonds created a funding hole that the firm could not bridge when confidence evaporated. You must understand that when Cooke failed, it was not merely a single bank failure, but a signal that the railroad credit model was broken. The New York Stock Exchange reacted by closing for 10 days, a dramatic pause that only amplified uncertainty among investors around the world. That closure was a warning sign that financial centers were not prepared for synchronized crises. You will visualize the nice closing as an unprecedented shock to global markets and a moment of collective dread. The exchange's 10-day closure prevented normal price discovery and created rumors that fed fear rather than calming it. Traders and brokers found themselves cut off from transactions, and the inability to trade amplified the perception of catastrophe. You must also consider how communication lags filled with speculation and bad information that made the situation worse. The pause allowed panic to spread to Europe as investors learned about the closure and began to reassess their own exposures. What seemed like a local emergency had become a global alarm bell that would ring in major financial centers. Across the Atlantic, Vienna had already seen its own crash months earlier in May 1873, and you should view that event as part of the same contagion story. A speculative bubble in Austrian railroads and banks had burst, creating massive losses for investors who were deeply integrated with European capital markets. The Vienna crash had weakened Europe as financial backbone, just as American vulnerabilities were becoming visible. You must remember that European banks and investors were deeply connected to each other and to foreign investments, which made the transmission of shocks much easier than before. When news from New York arrived, it landed on a nervous market that had already experienced a traumatic episode. The coincidence of crises in different regions turned local banking problems into a pan-regional calamity. You should understand Germany's role in this story because monetary policy there shifted the global balance between gold and silver. Germany had moved toward demonetizing silver, a policy that influenced international money supplies and investor expectations. That demonetization added deflationary pressure that made debt burdens heavier for borrowers in many countries. You must see the demonetization debate as more than technical monetary policy. It was central to who benefited and who suffered during the Depression. Debates over silver versus gold had political and economic consequences that shaped credit availability, export competitiveness, and the livelihoods of farmers and workers. The decisions made in Berlin and Vienna echoed across continents and intensified the downturn. What happened in London mattered because British banks and investors were deeply involved with both American railroads and continental finance. You must picture London financiers learning of simultaneous failures elsewhere and recalculating risks across their global portfolios. The British banking system had exposure to foreign loans and investments, which made it sensitive to shocks from New York and Vienna. You should also realize that London was a global clearinghouse for capital, and any sign of weakness there had implications for global credit conditions. As panic spread, liquidity tightened and interest rates rose in many markets, forcing borrowers to default and banks to face insolvency risks. The interconnectedness that enabled growth now accelerated the contagion in an unprecedented manner. As the panic unfolded, capital flows reversed and international credit markets froze almost overnight in many places. You must imagine letters of credit being questioned and remittances delayed as trust evaporated between banks. Exporters and importers suddenly found finance unavailable, and global trade began to contract sharply in response to the crisis. You should consider how that contraction hit commodity prices and agricultural incomes, particularly for regions dependent on exports to industrializing nations. Falling prices and tighter credit fed back into unemployment and bankruptcies, creating a downward spiral that expanded the crisis into a prolonged depression. The term long depression began to describe exactly how deep and persistent the damage would be. You need to know that unemployment rose dramatically as factories cut production and rail construction halted in many regions. Laborers, craftsmen, and displaced railroad workers found themselves without wages and with diminished prospects for reemployment. The social consequences were immediate and brutal in industrial centers and frontier towns alike. You must picture the growing unrest and the formation of strike committees and mutual aid groups, because these were the seeds of the modern labor movement. People who once trusted markets began to organize politically and economically to defend their livelihoods. What happened next transformed economic grievances into mass mobilizations that would shape politics for decades. The railroad strike of 1877 became a defining moment because it erupted across multiple American cities almost simultaneously. You must visualize trains halted, switchmen walking off the job, and crowds blocking locomotives as anger boiled over. The strike spread because economic pain was widespread and because transport paralysis amplified the visibility of grievances. You should also consider how government responses to the strike signaled new relationships between state power and industrial capital. Authorities often used troops to suppress unrest, and those actions hardened labor activism and deepened class tensions. The violence of 1877 was a clear example of how financial collapse can quickly become a political crisis. In Europe, similar unrest unfolded as unemployment and wage cuts led to strikes and riots in cities from Manchester to Berlin. You must imagine bread lines and protests outside factory gates, where workers demanded relief and political representation. The social fabric was strained because many governments lacked social safety nets or coherent responses to mass unemployment. You should note that these pressures accelerated the formation of political movements that sought structural changes to economic systems, socialist, labor, and reform movements gained ground because they presented responses to persistent inequality and insecurity. The crisis had thus created not just economic dislocation, but a political realignment across continents. You need to understand the monetary debates that followed because they were technical but consequential for recovery and distribution of pain. The crime of 1873 phrase captured the outrage of those who believed demonetizing silver had been a grave mistake. Farmers and miners especially saw silver's loss as a transfer of wealth toward creditors and urban elites who favored gold, backed deflation. You should grasp that monetary policy decisions were not neutral and had winners and losers, which is why the debate became intensely political in legislatures and on the campaign trail. Attempts to restore bimetallism or to expand the money supply met resistance from financial interests and international commitments to gold. Those unresolved disputes prolonged the economic malaise and shaped policy for years to come. What followed was a prolonged period historians term the Long Depression, stretching roughly from 1873 to 1879 and beyond in many regions. You must visualize persistent low growth, deflationary pressure, and long spells of unemployment that wore down communities. Recovery was uneven, and in many places painfully slow as investment stayed depressed for years after the initial panic. You should recognize that this long depression was global in scale because financial interconnections transmitted shocks and slowed the normal recovery mechanisms across borders. The stagnation sparked policy experimentation, social unrest, and shifts in political coalitions that changed the trajectory of nations. The human cost lasted years and remains an important chapter in understanding economic resilience. You must also consider the way this crisis birthed modern financial interconnectedness that remains relevant today. Banks and investors learned that foreign exposure could bring profits, but also synchronized risks that required new institutional responses. The Panic of 1873 forced policymakers and financiers to think about international cooperation, liquidity, and central banking in more systematic ways. You should see continuity from 1873 to subsequent crises because many solutions and mistakes from that era echoed in later panics. The emergence of organized labor, central bank policies, and debates over monetary anchors all trace lines back to responses from this global shock. In this way, 1873 shaped the modern financial architecture while signaling the dangers of tightly linked markets. You will find it instructive to compare the communication speed of 1873 with today, instantaneous markets to appreciate contagion mechanics. In 1873, telegraphs and steamships were fast enough to transmit panic across oceans in days rather than months. That speed turned previously local banking crises into nearly simultaneous global emergencies, teaching modern finance an early lesson about interdependence. You should also weigh how the tools for crisis management were limited, then compared to today, as central bank swaps and coordinated fiscal responses. Policymakers lacked the sophisticated instruments and international frameworks that later crises would inspire. The absence of such mechanisms prolonged and deepened the downturn in ways that resonate with contemporary thinking about systemic risk. As you reflect, remember that the Panic of 1873 reveals a truth about progress and risk that you still see today. You must accept that infrastructure booms financed by credit can deliver huge benefits and devastating collapses in equal measure. The same levers that build railways and networks can also produce overcommitment that becomes catastrophic when confidence dissolves. You should also conclude that modern financial systems evolved through crisis, driven reforms that were messy and politically contested. The emergence of labor movements, monetary debates, and institutional changes were all consequences of a painful learning process. The legacy of 1873 is therefore not only suffering, but also structural change that shaped subsequent economic governance. You must understand that narratives of inevitability often obscure human choices and political decisions that made the crisis worse. Bankers, politicians, and investors each acted with incentives that shaped outcomes, and those incentives can be altered by policy. The Panic of 1873 shows you how institutional frameworks and power balances influence who absorbs the costs of systemic shocks. You should also note that historical judgment is complicated because winners often rewrite the lessons after recovery. The contours of policy debates over silver, regulation, and labor rights were shaped by both economic analysis and political advantage. Recognizing that complexity helps you draw better lessons for how to manage modern systemic risks. You will also find moral hazards in the tale because reputation sometimes shielded risky behavior until they collapsed dramatically. Jay Cooke's stature insulated his firm for years until the failure became undeniable and catastrophic. The trust placed in individuals and institutions can therefore amplify risk until it implodes spectacularly when a tipping point is reached. You should take from this that transparency, diversified risk, and prudent leverage limits are more than abstract rules. They are practical defenses against systemic failure. 1873 taught investors and regulators that over-reliance on reputations and opaque balance sheets creates brittle systems. That lesson is painfully familiar when you consider modern financial crises and regulatory debates. What happened next will shock you because the human consequences were widespread and long-lasting across continents and classes. Farmers defaulted on mortgages, small merchants shuttered their shops, and families endured years of insecurity and migration. The social fabric was tested as communities resorted to mutual aid, charity, or migration to survive prolonged economic stress. You should also see how those hardships translated into political movements demanding change and accountability in ways that reshaped elections and legislation. Many reforms and new political forces trace origins back to the grievances of this period. In that sense, the Panic of 1873 was both an economic event and an engine of social transformation. You must confront the inconvenient truth that global interconnection brings both prosperity and synchronized vulnerability at once. The Panic of 1873 created winners and losers across national borders and highlighted how connected markets distribute shocks quickly. That duality is central to understanding why policymakers now talk about macroprudential regulation and international coordination. You should appreciate that the crisis was foundational because it provided a template for how global financial crises might unfold and how they might be addressed. The dialogues begun in the aftermath about liquidity provision. Bank supervision and monetary standards set precedents for later international financial architecture. These conversations continue to influence policy in your own time. If you look for modern parallels, you should see echoes in more recent crises where leverage, interconnectedness, and market psychology mattered. The pattern of speculative booms in an asset class followed by sharp deleveraging resembles crises you already know from the 20th and 21st centuries. Understanding the mechanical roots of the 1873 panic gives you perspective on systemic risks that persist despite technological change. You should also remember that the policy toolkit has grown, but human incentives and political constraints still limit reforms. Even with more sophisticated institutions, crises still occur because balance must be struck between innovation, growth, and stability. That tension makes the lessons from 1873 perpetually relevant as you evaluate modern financial policy. In the end, you should view the Panic of 1873 as the first clear demonstration of global financial contagion and systemic risk on a planetary scale. It taught governments, bankers, and societies that capital mobility can create extraordinary growth, but also synchronized collapse. The long depression that followed revealed how deep and persistent the fallout of such a collapse can be for ordinary people. You should leave this story with a sense that history is a laboratory from which you can derive practical wisdom for managing risk and designing institutions. Knowing how and why the crisis spread guides better policy thinking about transparency, liquidity backstops, and fair distribution of costs during downturns. That historical perspective is more valuable than any single technical formula. You also should reflect on the human capacity to rebuild and to innovate in the aftermath of disaster, because that is part of the story too. New regulatory practices emerged, and labor organizations pressed for protections that reshaped labor law and politics. Infrastructure continued to be built, but with lessons embedded about financing, risk sharing, and public accountability. You should therefore feel both the sorrow of the long depression and the resilience it eventually produced in institutional learning and political reform. The crisis was not an end, but a painful chapter that altered trajectories for finance, politics, and social movements in ways you still feel today. If this gave you a new perspective on the deep roots of modern financial interconnection, then the lesson is simple but urgent. You must pay attention to incentives, leverage, and cross-border linkages, because they determine how quickly problems will escalate. The Panic of 1873 is not just a dusty event, but a foundational case study for anyone worried about systemic risk in your era. You should take away that policy, vigilance, and democratic responses matter, because crises always involve distributional choices about who bears the cost. The history of 1873 challenges you to demand better transparency, fairer safety nets, and wiser stewardship of financial innovation. That is the practical legacy that matters for your future. Before we close, reflect on how quickly local financial decisions became global problems in 1873 and how that pattern has only accelerated. You should imagine markets today with trillions in cross, border claims, and instantaneous information flows, where contagion can spread even faster. The fundamental trade-offs between growth and stability that emerged in the 19th century remain central to your economic choices. Now, you should therefore be curious and cautious as you watch modern finance evolve, because history offers both warnings and remedies. The Panic of 1873 taught lessons about leverage, communication, and institutional response that are still relevant when crises loom in the headlines. Finally, remember that crises reveal not just technical failures, but human values and priorities that shape responses and recovery. You should ask yourself whose voices count when bailouts are discussed, and whose suffering is acknowledged when depressions drag on. The decisions made during and after the Panic of 1873 offer you a moral map for judging policy choices in future crises. You should leave with an awareness that historical memory is a tool for better policy, and that studying 1873 equips you to ask smarter questions about risk, responsibility, and fairness. If this history matters to you, you will demand that your institutions learn from it rather than repeat its mistakes. If this investigation gave you a new perspective on globalization, finance, and labor, then subscribe to follow deeper historical investigations about money and power. You should want to see more stories that connect past policy battles to your present dilemmas, because that is where real insight lives. The Panic of 1873 is a mirror, and you can use it to understand the risks that still shape your economic future. You should also share this video with someone interested in history, economics, or public policy, because the lessons are broadly applicable and urgently relevant. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join the conversation about how past crises inform better choices for tomorrow.